I would now like to formally begin today's conference and introduce David Naugle.
Hello to everybody participating this morning. Today's webinar is entitled Sage Grouse Biology and Ecology, a Primer. There'll be two presenters today, myself, Dave Naugle. I'm at the University of Montana, and I'm the science advisor for the NRCS Sage Grouse Initiative, and my colleague, Christian Hagen, who's at Oregon State University, will also be co-presenting, and he's the science advisor for the Lesser Prairie-Chicken Initiative. Sage grouse are a focal species for the health of the sagebrush ecosystem. A lot of folks call them a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. They're the largest of our 7 North American grouse species. They're also long-lived, up to 7 years. They're a sagebrush obligate critter that are dependent on sagebrush for every facet of their life history. Males are larger, about twice the size, 6 pounds, much bigger than the 2 to 3 pound female. And of course, they're famous for their lekking or breeding displays in spring that are happening right now in the field. There's 2 different species. The first is the greater sage grouse. Shown on this map, their historic range is the dark and light green color. The dark green is their current range across 11 states and 2 prairie provinces. Best estimates are 200,000 to 500,000 greater sage grouse across about 165 million acres. The second species, Centrocircus minimus, is shown in tan. This is the Gunnison sage grouse. There's about 5,000 individuals that remain for this species. Most of them are in Colorado. The dark tan on the map shows their current range, with their historic being in the lighter tan. There's also 2 greater sage grouse DPSs, or distinct population segments. The first one runs along the California and Nevada border, and it's called the Bi-State DPS. And there's a second one north of there in the state of Washington called the Columbia Basin distinct population segment. Both of those are circled in red. Greater sage grouse today is a state-managed species. In 2010, it was warranted but precluded under the Endangered Species Act, and today sits as a candidate. The calendar is slated for September 2015 for a final Endangered Species Act decision on whether to list it or not. And in the 2 prairie provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's already an endangered species under SARA, which is the Species at Risk Act and the federal equivalent of the United States ESA. A Gunnison sage grouse final determination under ESA is expected in summer 2014. And for the bi-state distinct population segment in Nevada and California, it's proposed threatened. But of course, recently that decision was backed up 6 months. And lastly, the Columbia Basin DPS in Washington is currently a candidate species.
Good morning. This is Christian Hagen. So as David mentioned, we've seen about a 50% contraction in the distribution of the species. That, combined with the ongoing threats facing the species and the population trends depicted in these particular figures, are some of the reasons why we see sage grouse being considered for the Endangered Species Act. So these figures show the population trends based on those LEC counts, or those breeding bird displays that Dave mentioned a moment earlier, which the state fish and wildlife agencies have been tracking fairly closely since about the mid-1960s. And what these figures show is that we've seen a long-term decline or reduction in abundance of grouse. Arguably, more recently, there's been a stabilization of populations, but abundances are lower than they've been in the past. Next. A part of understanding some of the ebbs and flows we see in the populations, we really need to understand their life history. And perhaps more importantly, for those of you in the field doing the conservation work to better things for sage grouse, it's important to understand how we might see the species respond to some of those conservation actions. So I'm going to take you back to your Biology 101 or your Ecology 101 and think about the R versus K selected species, right? So the R selected species was the mouse, and the K selected species was the elephant. And so in our case, within game birds, sage grouse is that elephant, and the pheasant is that mouse. And really, it's habitat driven, right? So in the pheasant world, the habitat is highly variable, highly unpredictable, right? They're in these modified agricultural landscapes that can kind of change at the drop of a hat. The sagebrush biome, on the other hand, is quite constant, actually, and predictable. Sure, it's a harsh environment, but it's quite predictable, right? Historically, the primary driver that would change the configuration of that sagebrush was fire. But we know from the science that's out there that fire return intervals at a minimum were about every 30 years. And in some cases, like the low sagebrush areas, fire return intervals are estimated somewhere over 100 years. So you've got these little, low sagebrush plants that could be 100 to 200 years old. So very different habitat. And so what that equates to is two different approaches in surviving in that landscape and ensuring that the species continues to persist. And so for a pheasant, in that highly unpredictable landscape, all of their investment is in reproductive output, right, much like our mouse. And so we see females laying 12 to 14 eggs in the clutch because they're lucky to be alive a year, maximum 2 to 3 years. And so they've got to take that chance to get as many copies of their own genes out into the landscape. Sage grouse, on the other hand, because the habitat is more constant and predictable, and they're long-lived, right? Females easily living 4 to 6 years. Very, very different from a pheasant. They don't have to invest as heavily in the clutch of eggs. So they only have about 7 to 9 eggs. And in fact, we know from following radial-marked females, when the habitats are in poor condition, we've seen up to 20%, 25% of a population of females actually forego nesting in a given year because they are hardwired to know that they should have another chance the following year to try and nest. Next. So when we look at those facets of reproductive output in sage grouse, we see that on average, when a female lays a clutch of eggs, about 40 to 50% of those nests are successful. Of those successful nests, we see about 40% of the chicks survive for 35 days. And then from there, in an average year, average conditions, we see about 2 of those chicks out of those broods actually get recruited into the spring population. That 4 to 6 year time frame for females to live equates to about a 60 to 70% annual survival rate. Next. And so really one of the most fascinating components of this bird is its lek-based mating system. And it's really not unlike the lek mating system of prairie chickens or sharp-tailed grouse if you're from that part of the country. But these leks and lek is a little bit of trivia here. Lek is a Scandinavian word that means to play. And so these are highly traditional sites. Males show extreme fidelity to these areas, returning to the same breeding ground year after year after year. But the lek, so David mentioned earlier that sage grouse are a canary in the coal mine for the sagebrush biome. The lek is very much a canary in the coal mine for the local population and the local nesting habitat. So the only reason the boys are where they are in the landscape is because the females have basically established that there is suitable nesting habitat in the vicinity. So the mating system provides 2 things. One, it provides us an indicator of population health in terms of the amount of nesting habitat that's in the vicinity, and it allows us an opportunity to monitor populations over time. And so, recall back those population trend figures I showed you. State Fish and Wildlife agencies have been counting sage grouse on leks since like the 1940s. And what we've learned from counting males on leks over time is that their distributions are highly clumped. And so if we looked at this example from northern Montana, we see that clump distribution basically equates there that 25% of the leks account for 53% of the population. So you're looking at a fraction of the area containing most of the birds, which becomes really important as we begin to think about where we want to spend conservation dollars and conservation efforts for the species. That further can be examined in the distribution of nests as they relate to lek sites. So falling radial marked birds is a great example from Wyoming, and there's others from across the range. But this is a great example from Wyoming, which when we follow these females in the landscape, we found that 75% of those females are nesting within 4 miles of where they were captured. So you put a 4-mile radius circle around a lek, that's 50 square miles. That's a fairly substantial landscape. But we also know that the distribution of those nests in that circle is not a random event. Those two are also highly clustered. And so we take the clump distribution of nests, we take the clump distribution of leks, and then that allows us to further inform our conservation targeting tools for where we're going to go on the landscape.
So we took leks across 11 western states, conducted some GIS analyses at the request of the Bureau of Land Management, and the core area concept was born. And so the map that you're looking at here shows the distribution of known leks buffered out from breeding sites by 4 miles, the distance that a majority of females will distribute themselves from lek of capture. And it kind of looks like a thunderstorm map if you were at home at night watching the Weather Channel. And the red areas are the smallest amount of area that encompasses 25% of the known breeding distribution. If you add orange to red, it's 50%. And if you add yellow to orange and red, it's 75% of the known breeding population. And light blue encompasses 100%. And so what you see across this huge 165 million acre occupied landscape is that 75% of the birds are in about 25% of the land base. And so this became an initial decision support tool for folks, knowing that conservation resources are limited and wanting to maximize return on investment. So if we do a conservation practice, we can benefit many birds instead of few birds. But that initial decision support tool was only based on breeding sites. And so now that concept has morphed into what we call PACs, or priority areas for conservation, as delineated by states, which the dark purple sites now include all seasonal habitats, where state game and fish agencies and their partners with local base knowledge have now refined those sites, and we have it for all 11 western states, and it's published in the 2013 Conservation Objectives Team report by the Fish and Wildlife Service, commonly referred to as the COT. Greater sage grouse populations vary greatly by state. And so shown here is a ranking of the 11 western states and 2 Canadian provinces in terms of percent range-wide population and how average male count per lek roughly corresponds to overall population size by state. 4 states contain about 83% of birds: Wyoming, Montana, Nevada, and Idaho. The other states, including Oregon, Utah, Colorado, California, into the DPS of Washington, the Dakotas, and then 2 small remaining populations in Canada, are important in maintaining sage grouse distribution and in maintaining their connectivity between populations. Surface ownership inside of those core areas where we have comprehensive data also varies by state. So here for the 11 western states, on average, range-wide, within those high bird distribution abundance areas, it's about 45% ownership by BLM and about 39% private. Other major players include U.S. Forest Service with 7%, BIA with 2%, and the National Wildlife Refuge System of Fish and Wildlife Service with 1%. Interesting to look across the range and how we would apply conservation has a lot to do with surface ownership, and it varies highly. You can see states like California and Nevada that are heavily skewed towards public surface, where on the flip side, other places like the Dakotas, state of Washington are almost entirely private. Genetic diversity in sage grouse is a story of isolation by distance, and maintaining connectivity in those lower abundant states is really important to keep distribution of birds. And so, courtesy of Sarah Euler-McCants at the U.S. Geological Survey, this map shows how she went out and surveyed genotypes of birds at these green dot locations. And then the pie charts and the colors within them represent the proportion of common haplotypes. And so you can see like haplotype X, the yellow, tends to be a Western genetic characteristic, where dominant haplotype A, the blue, moves more into the eastern range, and by the time you get up into management zone 1 in the northeastern part of the range, that maroon color, that EJ haplotype, is dominant. And so connectivity between these packs, so that we don't end up with isolated biological zoos, maintaining that connectivity and knowing how to do that is a big deal.
And ensuring that connectivity really requires us to take this landscape perspective, because what we're dealing with is a landscape scale species. Here's a great example from Idaho, right? So if you look at the very top row of this table, right, shows the annual seasonal range. This is for one bird, 1,000 square miles. This is a more mobile population, and Dave's going to talk about migration here in a moment. But what this drives home, right, so 1,000 square miles, if you've ever been to Rocky Mountain National Park, it's roughly 2 Rocky Mountain National Parks for this bird to fulfill its life history needs throughout the course of a year. But they don't use every square inch. Again, to reemphasize, the distribution of the species across the range is clumped. But even within the seasonal range of an individual bird, highly clumped, highly disproportional use of certain areas than others to meet the various needs that they have throughout the year. So the other lines in the table show the area needed for spring and summer use and autumn use, and winter use, depending on the year, would be probably somewhere more along the lines that we see summer brood use, a couple hundred square miles. So vast landscapes are required for this species. Next. So if I'm a sage grouse sitting on this hilltop looking out, this is what I like to see. Sagebrush from horizon to horizon. If I'm a bird or a population looking out from this hillside, things are actually probably quite good for this particular population. Having a landscape this large provides options for these birds to be able to select nest sites, to fulfill other life history needs, and we're going to talk more specifically here in a few minutes about those different seasonal habitat uses. But they've got to have options with regards to where to place their nest. You see the meadow in the background there. That's a great place to rear young. And so that vast landscape affords them the opportunities to seek out the appropriate habitat. Next. And as Dave mentioned, sage grouse truly are sagebrush obligate. And so in this particular slide, I need you to envision you're in a plane at about 10 or 20,000 feet. Okay, we're not measuring canopy cover with the transect. We're up in a plane. And what this slide really drives home is not only do these birds need large landscapes in which to have various options, but it needs to be sagebrush dominated. And so this is showing percent sagebrush in the landscape on the x-axis, and then we've got proportion of leks and basically the probability of lek persistence on the y-axis. And what this basically shows is that if you have less than about 50% of that landscape in sagebrush dominant or co-dominant cover, the likelihood of persistence declines dramatically. You get above 50% and probably more on the order of 70% or more, and the likelihood of persistence into the future increases dramatically. Next.
Migration in sage grouse is characterized three different ways. First of all, migration is a movement of greater than 6 miles. Some populations are resident, meaning that their breeding, summer, and winter seasonal habitats are all juxtaposed such that that landscape supports that population year-round. Other populations are stage 1 migratory, meaning that they will breed, summer, raise their young in one landscape, but then move a considerable distance to spend the winter somewhere else, and come springtime, they'll go right back to those breeding habitats. Other populations are 2-stage migratory, meaning that there's a pair of significant movements during the year, where they'll move from breeding to summer and again to winter and back again. Knowing in the landscapes that you live and work what the science is and how those populations that you work on every day, how they move and whether they're resident or migratory, is important to know. One example is the longest known annual migration documented to date. It's a 300-mile round trip from Saskatchewan down to central Montana and back. This happens to be a stage 1 migratory annual obligate event where birds go from summering habitat, which is silver sagebrush in Canada, Grasslands National Park and surrounding private lands, but then that habitat gets covered up by northern snows, and so there's no food in winter. And of course, sagebrush is the only thing that sage grouse eat in winter, and so those birds make a massive movement south to winter in Wyomingensis, big sagebrush. And on the wintering grounds, this migratory population actually mixes with a resident population, and then those northern birds break off come springtime and head right back to the leks where they had bred the previous spring. This is a map showing the vastness of that migration, and it makes you consider the size of the conservation effort that's required to maintain migratory movements. In the northern part of the graphic, you can see in pink Grasslands National Park. Those birds come down from grasslands, jump the Milk River, and winter in largely state-owned and in green Bureau of Land Management-owned sagebrush habitats. In 2011, we had an epic winter, and those birds' winter food actually got covered up where they typically winter, and so they pushed again another 50 to 75 miles south. Some of them even jumped the Missouri River, wintered on Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, where there were some wind-swept hilltops that had enough sagebrush. Not a single bird died in winter. They adapted well, and in springtime went right back to the leks in Canada and just south of the border in the U.S. And so this is a great example of fidelity. in sage grouse, this faithfulness and how they're hardwired to the particular landscapes where they live. And so despite these large annual movements, this fidelity keeps them in landscapes where they were born. And so fidelity makes populations quick to decline, but typically slow to recover. And that's why in many populations with anthropogenic effects or vegetative effects, you see lags where birds might take a year or two to respond to the event, but then they're typically slow to recover. And so maintaining these habitats, rather than trying to restore them, is a key message in sage grouse conservation. There are 27 different kinds of sagebrush species when you include subspecies and hybrids. They vary greatly across the 11 states and Canada. We have a pocket guide to sagebrush published by PRBO Conservation Science, and on your screen you can log on and read it and become familiarized with the species, subspecies, or hybrid in your area. We're learning a lot more about the chemistry of sagebrush and sage grouse foods. And sage grouse select these browse plants at multiple scales, broadly across habitat types, but then specifically within a patch, and even locally within an individual plant. And Fry's new work is showing how these birds select for higher nutritional content and try and stay away from these nasty secondary metabolites. Largely, we've learned that their dietary constraints can limit the use of the landscape, and it links back to Christian's comment on why these are landscape species, so that these birds have options and a large buffet from which to choose.
And so now we're going to talk about that buffet. And the calendar wheel on the right-hand side of your screen is a nice depiction that really breaks out the year as it pertains to sage grouse. And we're going to take those 5 different categories and really reduce them to kind of 3 legs of the stool. So you've got on the right, you've got leks, nesting, and early brood rearing. We're going to combine that and talk about breeding habitats. Late brood rearing really becomes summer for most sage grouse. Fall and winter ostensibly are the same thing, because we're really looking at a shift in diet to sagebrush, and the only thing that really differentiates fall from winter is the amount of snow on the ground. So when we talk about lekking habitat, the lekking season starts in March, goes into May. The lekking habitat, there are open ridges. Sometimes they're human disturbed areas where a salt lick or something has occurred. But the birds require an openness, right? The males want to be seen, and because they're so busy fighting for the rights to breed and so on, they want to be able to see and detect predators from a distance. So even though they're in these open areas, generally speaking, there's a stand of fairly dense, thicker cover of sagebrush close by, so that they can escape into that cover if, in the event there's a predator in the vicinity. Oftentimes, when they've completed their breeding activities for the day, they will saunter off into the sagebrush and just remain within a few hundred yards of that lek site while they'll loaf and feed throughout the day. So sometimes it gets confusing because so much of the analyses and things that you see in the literature are lek-based and so on and so forth. And so folks want to go out and create new leks because there's this perception that they're somehow limiting. But while it's well-intentioned, it's really not a conservation action that we want to get involved with, because the lek sites are not a limiting factor, right? As we mentioned earlier, that lek is a canary in a coal mine for the suitable nesting habitat in the vicinity. But by the same time, if we are conducting some sort of conservation activity in the vicinity of lek, we want to be sure that we minimize disturbances to those lek sites in the early morning hours from March to May. Some of the recent research coming out of Idaho and other places has indicated that fences close to leks can be problematic, and there's some really great decision tools out there to help you identify which fences or segments of fences are a potential problem for grouse. And so there's tools out there to figure out which of those fences perhaps should be marked. Next. So focusing in on sort of the brood or the female aspect of the population during the breeding season, right, which is nesting and early brood. It's important to note that sagebrush is the predominant cover for grouse to nest. It provides concealment cover for predators and provides the thermoregulatory controls that the female needs to incubate that nest, right? So she's sitting on this nest for 26 days. She gets off once in the morning to feed and relieve herself, and she gets off once in the evening to do the same. So she needs tremendous cover, and I mean that not necessarily in terms of total canopy, but just very, very well concealed cover, and certainly her plumage helps with that to some degree. And so with regard to nesting, we want to see about, as a general rule, about 15 to 25% canopy cover of sagebrush to hide that nest. You get into early brood rearing, the amount of sagebrush becomes not quite as critical. And so a lot of times when you're sitting in your pickup, cruising the habitat, we often overestimate how much sagebrush is actually on the landscape. So this particular slide does a great job in depicting what 15% canopy cover of sagebrush looks like. Now, oftentimes, folks will think that panel on the left, which is about 5% cover, is adequate. And really, it's not. Based on radiotelemetry studies, we know that when canopy cover drops below about 10% in most areas, really hens avoid those for nesting. What they prefer is on the right, so there and greater for nesting. Another important component to nesting cover is the herbaceous height. So some additional vertical screening adjacent to the shrub, as well as in the inner spaces between those shrubs. So we like to see 7 inches or more of that herbaceous height for nesting. That herbaceous height and then the herbaceous cover becomes very, very important for early brood rearing. So both of the herbaceous component, go ahead and hit next. So next. The herbaceous cover then provides the food source for these young chicks and for the hens and even other adult birds. So as we move in from nesting into early brood rearing, the herbaceous component itself provides food. It also provides food for invertebrates, which become a key component to the diet of sage grouse. I'm going to focus here on the brood rearing, but a lot of the diet here also pertains to adult birds, males and females as well. So in the lower center of your panel there, you'll see a sage grouse chick that's less than a week old. So that little fur ball, which hatches out about mid-May, we want to turn into a football, 2 to 5 pound football by football season. So it takes a tremendous amount of protein and calories to take that fur ball and turn it into a football. And those highly herbaceous habitats are absolutely vital in getting us there. Sage grouse lack a muscular gizzard. So unlike the pheasant, quail, prairie chickens, sage grouse cannot digest hard seeds. They are relegated to eating sagebrush, the leaves of forbs and other soft plants and bugs. That's it. They get quite a bit of their water from that herbaceous component, but they're always foraging near sagebrush cover. The herbaceous component is highly important, but there's always sagebrush cover nearby. And as summer continues, right, the birds, what we like to refer to as the green line, they'll follow that green line. So in some cases, where populations have the ability to actually follow that green line up the mountainside. So as the snow is receding, which sometimes is well into June and even early July, the birds are following the green up the mountains. And in other cases, populations have the ability to move down in elevation, right, down to wet meadows, some irrigated hay fields, alfalfa fields. Sometimes this is where you'll see sort of the interface of sage grouse and agriculture. Again, seeking out that highly succulent green forage and the invertebrates that go along with it. But really the most fascinating aspect of this bird's life history in terms of seasonal habitat is winter. And as Dave had illustrated very nicely, those extreme movements we saw out of Canada. And it is the one aspect of their life history, even though they show strong fidelity to all these seasonal use areas, winter is probably one place that they do show the greatest flexibility in terms of being able to move to different areas depending on the severity. So there's places in Oregon, for example, that we have these tremendous low sage flats. They're usually up on high windswept ridges that generally stay free of snow throughout most of the winter. If you're not familiar with low sage, those plants are generally the size of a sage grouse, oftentimes smaller. But they're tremendous in terms of all the sagebrushes. They're one of the highest in protein, and so they'll seek those areas out so they can persist there. But when they do have deeper snowpacks, they'll move into these areas where sagebrush is exposed above the snowpack, which generally are your big sages, Wyomingensis, Basin Big, where it is exposed above the snow. So the structure is a little bit harder to define. The critical piece is it available above the snow. One little fun fact about sage grouse in winter is when the snow conditions are just right, they'll actually snow burrow. They'll actually burrow into the snow to roost overnight, much like we see rough grouse doing in the forests of the northern U.S. and into Canada. Next. So to kind of bring the seasonal habitat use to a wrap here, this particular figure shows us how sage grouse are selecting some of these different vegetation structures over between nesting and brood rearing. And so if you look on the y-axis, we've got a scale of -1 to 1. So if you're above 0, you're selected for. If you're below 0, it's selected against. So the white circles are nest site selection. The various shades of gray are different definitions of brood rearing. So what we see is that sagebrush cover is selected for nest sites as it relates to random points in the surrounding landscape. Alternatively, sagebrush cover is selected against relative to, sagebrush in brood rearing areas it's selected against relative to random points in the surrounding landscape. Grass cover, grass canopy cover, essentially selected for all life history stages as it pertains to random points in the surrounding landscape. Forbs, obviously selected much more for in brood rearing areas than nests. And grass height, again, we see selection for in essentially all life history stages. Again, as it relates to random points in the surrounding landscape. And we could overlay to some degree wintering with nests. When we look at the structure of sagebrush, generally those stands that are adequate for nesting certainly have the qualities to provide nest or winter range, but it's not always the case. But the important thing to remember is I provided you some figures and numbers with respect to sagebrush cover, grass height, etc. It's always important to remember that those are just guidelines. They're sort of the general rules. You always need to refer to sort of your ecological, your local information, and ecological site potential is going to help determine what the site's really capable of.
So let's shift gears a bit and cover aspects of disease, predation, and hunting. Sage grouse are susceptible to disease, specifically West Nile virus. And in that cycle, Culex tarsalis is the competent vector, shown here as this mosquito species, where if you look at its proboscis, it has that white ring around it. And so imagine that mosquito poking its proboscis into your arm in summer, and as it draws a blood meal, it regurgitates a small component of its gut contents back into the host. And that's the way that incidental hosts like humans and horses, which we monitor for West Nile virus, can become infected. Another incidental host is sage grouse. To date, through drawing blood and monitoring populations, we know that resistance to this disease remains low. And so there's no signs yet of adaptation where Mother Nature is taking care of this problem for us. We've monitored West Nile virus and published work across these 12 populations. And the top 4 populations, you can see that they were tested for West Nile virus and had positive tests. And on average, survival rates were about 10% lower in infected versus non-infected populations. In the initial outbreak years, we monitored populations as the virus swept across from the East Coast to the Pacific across North America. And in those outbreak years in Wyoming, Montana, and Alberta, we found that about 25% of all reproductive females suffered mortality during those years. Lower survival occurs during outbreak years. It affects all sex and age classes. Tends to be a range-wide issue, and West Nile should now be considered an endemic disease and is most severe with periodic outbreaks in mid to low elevations where impacts can be greatest. In higher elevations, there's fewer growing degree days and less of a chance for the disease to be impactful. We've also learned that disease impacts can be compounded when additional surface water is put onto the landscape with things like energy development. Studies out of places like the Powder River Basin of Wyoming, where you have to lower the head to bring up the gas during extraction. There's millions of gallons of water that are put into thousands and thousands of surface ponds. And what we've learned is that as those populations are impacted by energy development, during outbreak years, small leks that are already impacted by energy development can wink out when they're hit with this compounding impact.
So the other thing that can kill a grouse is predators. But recall, survival is very high in this species. So sage grouse have co-evolved with a suite of predators over time. Once they become adults, really predation is not an issue when you have adequate habitat in the vicinity. Where we're most concerned about grouse mortality is really in the nest and the first 2 weeks after a nest has hatched. Chicks are highly, highly vulnerable during that time of year. So as long as we have good quality habitat, a population should be able to persist just fine in the face of normal predator abundances and populations. It's when the habitat becomes fragmented, whether it be through anthropogenic disturbances or natural processes, where predation can be, I guess you could say predators have an unfair advantage, if you will, over grouse. So we have, the conifer encroachment issue that is a great one, especially in the work that folks like yourselves will be engaged in. Removing those trees removes those perches and hiding places for predators. Similarly, eliminating old structures for denning sites or old fences or old windmills as perch sites. So there's some opportunities through the programs that NRCS is engaged in that can help alleviate some of that predator risk. Those are, of course, all non-lethal methods. You get into this whole discussion of predator control, lethal predator control. There may be some limited cases where you have small populations or reintroduction of populations that some short-term lethal controls may be implemented, but really is not a long-term solution. It's really all about habitat restoration. Next. The other thing that, of course, can kill a grouse is a hunter. So as Dave mentioned in the very beginning, sage grouse are a state trust species and are a game species in 10 of the 11 states. The only state it is not is the state of Washington, where it is state listed. So of those 10 states that harvest is technically legal, only 8 of those states actually held a hunting season in 2013. So 2 of the states had concerns over population levels and trends, and they chose not to have a harvest in 2013. 7 of the 10 states that still technically allow harvests to occur are now by permit only. So those of you that are familiar with hunting, are familiar with, 3 in the bag, 6 in possession. For those of you not hunters, what that means is that, in the past we'd go out, you could hunt, you could have harvest up to 3 birds in a day and have 6 in the freezer. Well, most states are moving away from that, and we're really gone to these permit systems. So it's much like a deer tag or an elk tag. You get your tag for 1 or 2 sage grouse for the season, and you're done. And this little figure on the right that shows the harvest trend in Oregon is reflective of the change in harvest, both as a function of population size, but also on the right-hand side of that panel shows how harvest has been regulated and maintained at very low levels over the last 20 to 30 years. So through that permitting system, we ensure that harvest stays below 5% range-wide. The tighter regulations allow wildlife biologists to collect information from the wings of birds harvested by hunters, so we can garner productivity estimates, sex ratios, hatch dates across very broad scales that otherwise that data would just simply not be available. And there's some recent information that suggests that we can actually estimate population size from some of these hunter-harvested data sets. Next.
So the primary threats being addressed across the range to reduce impacts and maintain healthy populations really depend on where you have your boots on the ground. And so the 8 primary threats identified in the Conservation Objectives Team report, or the COT, and supported by WAFWA's near-term sage grouse conservation strategy are shown on this slide and the next as maps. And so these maps show sage grouse management zones in blue polygons and populations within those shaded light green. The place that the threat is relevant is colored red. And so in the Columbia Basin distinct population segment and large parts of Management Zone 1 in the northeast part of the range, it's agricultural conversion. Urbanization or subdivision into sagebrush habitats is more widespread compared to energy development that has some impacts in the western range, but is really a Management Zone 1, 2, and 7 issue. And then numerous other forms of infrastructure like power lines and roads is range-wide. And then more western issues include the expansion of conifer into formerly unoccupied areas, and then catastrophic wildfire in the Great Basin and other western states, which is also linked to the invasion of exotic annuals like the nasty feedback loop with cheatgrass. And then listed last by WAFWA is the need long-term for sustained investment to maximize return on investment for our conservation actions. And so in closing, one of the last messages that we wanted to leave you with. We jokingly talk about the need to keep Humpty Dumpty up on the wall, because once Humpty Dumpty falls, he's just like sagebrush ecosystems. They're difficult to put back together. And so prevention in conservation is easier than restoration. And as we all know in the sage grouse arena today, that's going to take the right policies and the right practices in the right places. So thanks to everybody who's working on sage grouse and putting effort into this every day to help maintain healthy wildlife populations through sustainable ranching, and we really appreciate your time today.
And David, it looks like we do have two questions that came in via the Notes tab.
Okay.
First we have, can you clarify what you mean by AG conversion?
Sure. And so agricultural conversion is prolific up in Management Zone 1 in the northeastern part of the range, Montana, Dakotas, and northeast Wyoming, and also Alberta and Saskatchewan populations. And so agricultural conversion is when a rancher decides to become a farmer, and those sagebrush habitats are broken by the plow and turned into wheat fields. And to somebody working in the Great Basin or maybe in other western populations where agricultural conversion is not a big deal, it is listed as the primary stressor in the northeastern part of the range.
Okay, next we have, how can you protect habitat in high priority areas when there are interstate transmission lines being planned and installed? These transmission lines are part of the President's Initiative of Energy Independence.
Probably the major advance in sage grouse conservation in the last 5 years is the idea of packs. And so much of the public land policy and protection on private lands is geared towards reducing impacts of human infrastructure in these high bird abundance areas. And so while not perfect and our national energy policy is still being shaped, a primary interest by decision makers should be to route large infrastructure projects away from big sage grouse populations to reduce the need for things like Endangered Species Act listings.
Okay, next we have a question about predation. We hear a lot from producers how they think there has been an increase in eagles, hawks, etc. Is there any data out there showing an increase in these populations?
Yeah, so I think probably the best data sets we have are on the breeding bird survey data, and I think where we see the largest increases is likely in ravens. I don't know that necessarily that eagles show the same population growth that some of these other things do, but there is some data that would tend to point towards that. But I guess I would encourage folks to think about it in the context of, you're hearing that from producers, and it's a valid concern. So the question is what can we do about it? And, I would encourage you to sort of acknowledge and say, yeah, that may be going on. What sort of steps can we take on your ranch to alleviate any perches or things that may be giving those critters an undue advantage? Because getting into the whole conversation about predator control is just something that is going to be too contentious. There's not much we in the field can do about that anyway. And so try to focus on the proactive things that you can do to alleviate perches and den sites and other things on the ranch with that producer.
Okay, hearing no other questions then, again, thanks for your time, and we really appreciate the opportunity to present the information today. Have a great afternoon.